So hello everyone. Can everyone hear me? I hope so. Oh, perfect. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to introduce Elena, and I'm going to just introduce how we are going to work today. So Elena Villafuerte has been the Advocacy Officer of Transnational Justice Area for the Project for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. She has an BA in Political Science at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She was chosen for the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations as a representative of Mexico in the 2015 Summer School for Policy Advocacy and Peace Organization in New York. And she was also a trainee on the International Service for Human Rights Training on Business and Human Rights Advocacy in Geneva. As a responsible for advocacy programs at PRODEC, which is her organization, she is specialized on business and human rights from the national, regional, and international perspectives. So a little bit about the organization where she works, which is called the Project of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This organization is a non-governmental organization which was founded in 2015. PRODEC is dedicated to contributing to the validity to justice and the fulfillment of economic and social and cultural rights of communities and workers with the goal of creating a just and dignified world for all. This organization's work is focused on highlighting the failure of the state to guarantee economic, social, and cultural rights, stimulating a debate on the obligation of state institutions to make them accessible and justiciable, and above all, a companion process that contributes to the enjoyment of these rights. The main areas of this organization's work is the defense and promotion of labor rights and rights connected with the land, territory, and natural resources, the security of human rights defenders, and monitoring the compliance of transnational companies and the state with their human rights obligations. The cross-cutting themes of the work of this organization is transnational justice, gender perspective, diversity, education, and technical assistance. As you can see, she has so much experience on the topic, and she has a lot to share with us. So the way the webinar is going to go is that we are going to have around 1 hour of her presentation, and then half an hour for your questions or comments or anything that you want to contribute to the discussion. My name, I didn't say it before, is Patricia, and I'm the project manager for the project of empowering networks of NGOs in a multipolar and unequal world, which is a project that is done by Iniciativa Ciudadana, which is a Mexican NGO, Oxfam, and the European Union. And I will be accompanying this process, this webinar, with you guys, and I'm going to be the one keeping the time so that you can go to work and do all your activities after this webinar. So thank you so much for being here. If you have any questions or comments, you can put it in the chat that you can see in your screen. And then when the half an hour of comments and questions starts, we're going to read your questions and your comments from the chat so that it's it's more easier to respond to all your questions and to address your comments. So welcome everyone to this webinar on business and human rights. And I'm going to welcome Elena Villafuerte so that she can start sharing with you. Thank you.
Hello, good morning to everyone, and good afternoon, depending on your time. My name is Elena Villafuerte. As Patricia said, I am advocacy officer at PRODESC, a human rights organization based in Mexico City, founded in 2005, and with work on many parts of the country, especially on the north, on the state of Sinaloa, where we work with temporary migrant workers who go every year to the United States through the H2 program visas, and also on the state of Durango, also in the north of the country, where we are escorting a case with regarding the defense of land and territory against a mining company, a Canadian mining company. And also 2 other cases on the state of Oaxaca, on the south of the country, where we are defending communities, agrarian communities mainly, on the defense of land and territory also, but on cases regarding the violation of human rights made by wind energy projects. So, first of all, I would like to thank Patricia and Iniciativa Ciudadana and also CAIMEX for this opportunity to speak with you about the business and human rights perspective and all the work that has been done. I know that some of you may be familiar with some issues regarding business and human rights, but some of you are not. So I'm going to make a very, very basic introduction to the subject of business and human rights, starting with the timeline or the background of all the work that has been done, especially in United Nations and other international organizations or bodies. And then we're going to develop especially the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and their implementation in different countries, and finally a process that has been started since 2014 regarding the process of the implementation, not the implementation, but the making of the binding treaty on business and human rights. So first of all, we could think that because of the dynamics of the economy on the past, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, the business and human rights issue is quite new. And maybe it is regarding the UN guiding principles, but we started to talk about the activity of transnational corporations since the 1970s, especially since 1972, when the president of Chile in that time, who was Salvador Allende, was accusing especially U.S. companies, United States companies, in particular the International Telegraph and Telephone Company and the Kenneth Copper Corporation, which had activities on Chile, to intervene on their internal politics. So it was a very specific complaint, and as some of you know, in 1973 there was this coup when the President Salvador Allende was taken off of the government, and then he suicided, and everything that leads to a dictatorship from General Augusto Pinochet during 20 years, more or less. So it was the first complaint against transnational corporations. And then, also in 1972, there was a conference of United Nations on Trade and Development, also in Santiago de Chile. And then they had this statement where they asked the multinational corporations to have a more specific role and also specific rules to guide their operations in other countries. It was a gap that was founded, especially in this conference where there was no law or treaties or something legally binding that could oblige the enterprises to behave on the countries they were investing on. So in 1974, a group that was appointed by the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations drafted a report that was focused on the acting of these enterprises. So they recommended that the governments in the world should have a recognized set of rules or a system of information disclosure regarding the operations of the transnational corporations. But the Economic and Social Council just established the Commission on Transnational Corporations, and then a Center on Transnational Corporations for research and administration of the process, but it didn't go that far on implementing rules. But in 1977, it was established an intergovernmental working group, which had a very specific mandate, which was to start working on a draft of code of conduct for enterprises. There were 48 countries on this on this group, and they started to draft this this code of conduct, but it didn't go so far either. So the thing is that by the 1980s, there were like 30 different codes of conduct adopted by different bodies of United Nations and also other international organizations, but not something that was mandatory. So we had by mid-80s like 30 or more codes of conduct, for example, from the International Labour Organization, from the World Health Organization, from the Food and Agriculture Organization, and also from the United Nations Children's Fund. So we had all of these, but all of them failed, and also we are starting to see that this is the time when we are experiencing the change on the political and economic model to the transition to the neoliberal model. So with the governments of both Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. So it was a very, very clear transition between the efforts on the 1970s to make a regulation on the activity of transnational corporations with a set of rules. And then in the 1980s and 1990s especially, there was this feeling that the United Nations and also the enterprises and also the governments could work together like a multi-stakeholder initiative where they can have consensus and all with voluntary agreements. So in 1999, there were some initiatives pushing, especially the UN Secretary General in that time, who was Kofi Annan, to make something about the acting of multinational enterprises. And then Kofi Annan, who was participating very actively in forums like the Economic Forum on Davos, Switzerland, and all these spaces that were much more economic, appointed the Professor John Ruggie from Harvard University to make a plan just to include the enterprises on a pact that could be signed by all, that could be voluntary, that could be pursuing the central United Nations principles, principally in human rights, core labor standards, environment, and after, in 2004, fighting against corruption. And it was the creation and the presentation in the year 2000 of the Global Compact, which is like a big pact of 7,000 participants from the corporate sector in 145 countries around the world. So it's a group of enterprises of all sizes, mainly big enterprises, which apply the codes that are established by the Global Compact regarding all those principles established by United Nations, and they are voluntary, and they are like a good sign of the things that could be advancing on the business and human rights agenda. But it was not enough, not for the organizations and for the people that have always had complaints with the activity of the multinational corporations. So, on 2003, yes, there was a little initiative regarding the drafting of norms, were like norms on business and human rights that were mandatory, but the United Nations Human Rights Council didn't make anything about them. They were drafted, they were put on the agenda of the Human Rights Council, but they didn't have any progress, because as we see, the main lead on these years is to have initiatives that are voluntary and with a vision of multi-stakeholder alliances and consensus and everything. So the norms were not on that road. So the norms were not had not a very good ending, but in 2005, the Secretary General, Kofi Annan, appointed a special representative on business and human rights, especially because of all the violations committed by transnational corporations. It was necessary to have someone who can make, let's say, a process of research about the subject and make some considerations, but also some suggestions on how to move forward. And the best person Kofi Annan could find was also this professor from Harvard University, who was the responsible for the Global Compact, who is Professor John Ruggie. So Professor John Ruggie became the special representative for business and human rights of the United Nations in 2005. And he had a very wide job of consultations and research during 3 years. And then he presented at the United Nations the results of his research and interviews and consultations with communities, with governments, with enterprises, with everyone he could have interaction with regarding this process. And he presented this in 2008. So he said that he needed another process just to know how to put on paper or to set a project to address everything that he found on his research. So in 2011, there were presented the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the most advanced initiative the United Nations has had on the business and human rights perspective. But we're going to discuss further about the United Nations Guiding Principles, not all, because when you were when you were invited to this webinar, maybe the organizers sent you the guiding principles on business and human rights. So if you had the chance to read them, if not, we're going to send them just to have the whole information. There are 31 guiding principles which cover a lot of the human rights violations made by the acting of multinational corporations, but it's not the only initiative that we have. We have also, as I said, the codes of conduct of different bodies of United Nations. We have the Global Compact, but also we have something that is not from the United Nations, which is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. The OECD, which is the Organization for Economic and Development on Cooperation and Development, established in 1976 these guidelines, which are mandatory, especially for the countries which are part of the OECD. For example, if Mexico or United States or Spain or France or United Kingdom are part of OECD and they have enterprises who have investments abroad, they have to encourage, the governments have to encourage their enterprises to comply these guidelines. And in 2011 was the last reform of these multinational enterprises guidelines, and there was a reform regarding human rights. So if an enterprise, for example, from United Kingdom is investing in, let's say, Mexico, and this enterprise is violating human rights and or violating the other guidelines of OECD, which are a very extensive number of guidelines, and we can also share them with you after this webinar. If any one of them is not complied by the enterprise, a group, a community, an organization can set a complaint on the national contact point of OECD on their countries. On their origin country, where the violation is settled, or on the origin country of the enterprise. Both of them can and may decide on the complaint. So it's not a judicial mechanism, it's more a negotiation mechanism, but it's quite useful, for example, for advocacy and for also negotiation with enterprises or dialogue, for establishing dialogue. So this is another example of rules that can be set for multinational corporations. But getting back to the guiding principles, which is the main initiative of the United Nations, we have that there are 31 principles divided into 3 pillars. So its main sources, as Professor Ravi said, it's the International Bill of Human Rights and the International Labour Organization's Declaration in Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. So it's not that the guiding principles are saying something new, but they are taking things that are already established in other convenings and bills and everything on human rights. So they're just putting it together to set a group of principles that should be accomplished by states and enterprises, and also international bodies and organizations regarding the violations of human rights on the enterprise activities. So We're going to start with the pillar 1. I'm not going to say principle by principle because, as I said, we're going to send you the guiding principles. So you will have the opportunity to look at them all. But what I'm going to do is to just set the main subjects of each pillar, and then we're going to go to the discussion on how are they implemented. The first pillar is the state duty to protect human rights. So, as you see, the main actor of this pillar is the state and their obligation to respect human rights. And it covers the principles 1 to 10. And it mainly says that the state can fulfill these duties through appropriate policies, through regulation of the activity of enterprises, but also through adjudication. These are specific activities that states can and should fulfill just to guarantee that the enterprises that are entering to a country respect the human rights, but it is the state's part of the problem. The pillar 2, that is almost half of the guiding principles, is the corporate responsibility to respect human rights. It goes from the principles 11 to 24. And basically, it says that corporations should act with due diligence to avoid violating the rights of others and to address adverse effects with which they are involved. So, one main concept on business and human rights study is the due diligence, especially from enterprises, because, and it's something that is present in almost every sentence on the guiding principles, especially in the second pillar. The obligation of the enterprises to make this process of consultation, of approach to the communities, to the groups, to the populations on which they are going to settle their investment projects, so that they can have the feedback of the population, so that they can have the feeling of what are the special or the potential human rights violations that the population feels that the project could have. So basically what Professor Rogi says, the pillar 2 is to know and show. Know what are the advantages and disadvantages of implementing a project in certain communities, and show them, to be transparent. But there's also a principle on pillar 2 that says that all these enterprises should have on their code of conduct, their internal code of conduct, a statement on human rights, and it should be public. It could give an idea to the population or the communities on which they're trying to invest. What is the vision of the enterprise and how can they interact with them if they want to. But that is a very, very main issue, and it's also important for something I'm going to say after, but on these guiding principles, it is said that these principles apply to every type of enterprise. It could be a little one, it could be a big transnational corporation. It applies to everyone. We are pretty familiar with the violations of human rights made by transnational corporations, but the guiding principles cover the activities of all the enterprises. So that is mainly what the second pillar talks about. And then there is the third pillar, which is the access to remedy. And the main focus of this pillar is the victims of the violations of human rights. We, as human rights defenders, is the pillar that we are most familiar with. We have not had experiences or many successful experiences with the first and the second pillars. I mean, with the state's obligation of respecting or protecting human rights, and also the duty of the enterprises to also respect the human rights of populations. So we have to always, or most of the time, go or through the process of the judicial or non-judicial mechanisms in order to give remedy to the victims of the human rights violations committed by the enterprises. But they cover only the principles 25 to 31 of the guiding principles, so it's the smallest part of the principles. It's, as I said, dedicated for the victims of business-related abuse. It can be judicial or non-judicial, as I said. I mean, we can go to the courts on our countries. Also, is not quite developed on the guiding principles, but also extraterritorial obligations. I mean, to go to the court of the country of origin of the enterprise, but it's not quite developed on the guiding principles. It's mainly developed on the origin of the violation, which is the country of investment of the company, and the non-judicial mechanisms. And then there's someone who already sent the guiding principles, so thank you very much. If you can read them, you can see that they have the guiding principles, but also the comments on how they should be developed. And as I said, the third pillar is settled on this, and the non-judicial mechanisms can cover, for example, as an example, what I said before of the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises, but also initiatives regarding a company or mechanism or department that can be in charge of making due diligence, but also to give remedy to victims. It can be possible, maybe. And they state that the states must investigate, punish, and redress the violations of human rights on the acting of the companies, the multinational companies, or all companies, as I said. They sound quite good. There are 31 principles, and they have a lot of comments, and they're made with a lot of research. As we can, if we are just making the addition, we are talking about 6 years of work from the appointment of the special representative of business and human rights and the publication of the UN guiding principles. It's 6 years of work. So they're a pretty strong document. But as we said, the trend is not to have a legally binding mechanism. So the guiding principles are not legally binding. They are voluntary, and the compliance should be guided by the states, but always in a voluntary process. So the way they are translated into real application is a national action plan. Through a national action plan. What is a national action plan? Is the implementation of policies that, in this case on business and human rights, can apply most of the guiding principles, especially the ones concerning the activities of the state, because they are implemented by the state and planned by the state in most of the times, but also it could be made by multi-stakeholder initiatives. We're going to see some examples of implementation of and planning of national action plans in some countries, so don't worry, you're going to understand. And yes, they are this implementation from the states. And we have very little response from the states to the National Action Plan till today. So the published National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights are the ones from United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Denmark, Finland, Lithuania, Norway, Sweden, and Colombia, which is the only one on the Latin American region which has already published their National Action Plan. There are 2 drafts of NAP, of National Action Plans, and they're the ones from Italy and from Spain. As you can see, of all the countries that are part of the United Nations, it's a very, very small percentage of those countries which are applying the National Action Plans or the guiding principles through National Action Plan. In our region, and I say our region because I'm Mexican, in Latin America there are 6 countries that have expressed their interest on starting a process towards the National Action Plan. So it's Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Nicaragua, and Peru. There are these 6 countries which are on different stages of the process. As you can imagine, it's not an easy process, and there are some actors that have been developing a methodology to make this National Action Plan, especially the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR, and in a collaboration with the Danish Institute of Human Rights. They have been making and developing a methodology to the planning and implementation of national action plans in different states. And they also have a toolkit that we can also send to you that establishes a methodology to make a national baseline assessment before planning, and more even implementing a national action plan. And the National Baseline Assessment, or NBA, is mainly, or in the methodology of ICAR and the Danish Institute of Human Rights, is mainly focused on the pillars 1 and 3. Why? Because the country or the state is the one who implements and plans the National Action Plan. So it's mainly focused on make legal research of all the laws and the convening signed by the state, which is going to make a national action plan, just to see what is the level of compliance with the UN guiding principles already before the implementation of a national action plan. And mainly to their goal or their aim is to identify the gaps between the guiding principles and the legal framework on which these countries are working already. It's a very useful methodology, and it has been used in many countries. For example, South Africa, United States, Denmark, Chile, and also it's been used in Mexico in the process which I'm going to speak to you about. This process is not simple. The National Action Plan requires, as the human rights organizations who work on the business and human rights agenda, we said that it's not a process that only we can sit a group of people in the table with the government and the enterprises and just decide how to do this. It requires the national baseline assessment, which is a very, very difficult job, and which, I don't know, it takes to be done properly at least a year, and also another year of consultations and planning with all the actors that are involved in the process, and the negotiations and everything that involves the correct process of a national action plan. So also in the national action plan specific methodology, it is settled that there should be done some consultations to population in different moments by regions, depending on the size of the country, just to ensure that everyone that has or could be affected by the acting of corporations, of enterprises, can be taken into account on the process. So I'm going to talk to you about a few processes so that you can have an example of how the national action plans are working in reality. First, there is the case of South Africa, for example, where the main authority who was developing the national action plan was the Institute for Human Rights in South Africa, and they were having this process being escorted. Especially, civil society had a sort of alliance with the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR, just to implement the methodology that we said on the national baseline assessment. And they invited on one of the consultations that is also established on the national baseline assessment to this Institute of Human Rights, and then they listened to the communities and to the civil society and every actor who was present on that event. And the Institute of Human Rights in South Africa determined that they wanted to do the process together with the civil society. So quite a successful case of the process of a national action plan. And I think that we're going to see very soon the publication of the National Action Plan of South Africa, which is very important because, as some of you may know, South Africa has a lot of multinational corporations on their country, investing on their country. So mining projects or water projects or electricity projects. So it's going to be very important to see the result of the collaboration between civil society communities and also the Institute for Human Rights in South Africa. Other experience that is not that positive, at least from the view from the civil society, is the experience from Colombia. As I said before, is the first and or for now the only country in Latin America which is having their national action plan published. The process started in early 2015, and the national action plan was published on December 2015. As you can see, there was not a very long process. We are talking about the organizations that work on this subject. We're talking about a period of 2 years from the national baseline assessment to the publication of the national action plan, just to have a very good process. So Colombia did it in less than a year, which is quite concerning. It was conducted by the President's Counselor on Human Rights and also a technical roundtable composed by, for example, UNICEF or the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Colombia and some other agencies from the government. The first draft of the National Action Plan was published on October 2015, and it was followed by 4 consultations, 1 national and 3 made by regions. And Colombia is not that an extensive territory, so there were made 4 consultations on the process. And the main focus of the National Action Plan in Colombia, as you can imagine, is the peace process and how the corporations could be safe and their investments could be safe on this process of peace with guerrillas and also with the drug cartels. So it's much more in that context, which is made the National Action Plan, not in the context of the violations of the corporations and the remedies for the victims of the violations, although there are several cases of human rights violations by enterprises in Colombia. And well, as I said before, the Colombian civil society has said that the process was opaque and not very inclusive. So they didn't feel represented on the process. Most of them didn't know about the process for a very long time. So we don't see the National Action Plan of Colombia as the best example of what should be done on the Business and Human Rights National Action Plan. And we're going to talk about a little bit about the process also in Chile. In Chile, the government is also implementing the process of the National Action Plan, but the government has been very sensible with the process. So they have settled a time to do a national baseline assessment conducted by a university, the University Diego Portales, in Chile, and there is a special unit just drafting the national baseline assessment to ensure that they have the knowledge and the whole perspective of the legal framework of Chile before starting the conversation of a national action plan. So there's the process in Chile. Also in the United States, we are expecting soon the publication of the National Action Plan of the United States. So it's going to be interesting. Mainly, we would want to see a part of extraterritorial obligations of the U.S. companies, which are investing abroad, but we're going to see. On that case, the U.S. government, especially the Department of State, made a national baseline assessment, also with quite a time for developing it. But the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, ICAR, made a national baseline assessment shadow, which is going to be a contrast with the vision of the government. So we are expecting to see United States National Action Plan. Canada, which has a lot of complaints, mainly in the region and also in other countries and other continents, because of the acting of their mining companies mainly, have not developed, not even given a sign of developing the process of a national action plan. It was said in some moments that this new prime minister could make something regarding a national action plan, but we're not quite certain about that. And but it may be possible, because there's another process that I'm going to talk to you about in a few minutes, that it's pushing many countries and many developing countries and many developed countries to start implementing the guiding principles through national action plans. And in Mexico, on 2014 and early 2015, the Mexican government announced the intention to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. It's going to be led by the Internal Affairs Ministry. And on September 2015, they started a multi-stakeholder group, which includes one union and some enterprises and civil society organizations, and also other representatives of other institutions from the government and also state enterprises, just to start the conversations about the national action plan. But the Mexican government has not taken the engagement to do a national baseline assessment. Instead of that, it is the first time that civil society is going to lead the national baseline assessment. I mean, as far as we know, the official baseline assessment, which is going to be used for the implementation of the national action plan, and also for the planning and all the negotiations regarding this plan. And it's done by a group of 8 organizations, which is the Focal Group on Business and Human Rights. And on this group of organizations is PRODESC, which is the organization I work for. And we are very focused on this process, on how we can move forward, and we expect to have a draft of the national baseline assessment this year. I mean by July, August maybe, because the intention of the Mexican government is to have a 2-year evaluation of implementation of the national action plan, which means that they should have completed and published the national action plan by December of this year. So it's a very complicated process. As you can see, it's not that long. The times are quite similar from the ones of Colombia, but we are doing our best efforts to make the things work at least as we expected. And also we are asking for the consultations led by the government to be representative and inclusive and the most transparent as possible. And because Mexico is quite a big country, so they should have into account everyone that could be or are being affected by the acting of the multinational enterprises. And well, there's all these processes that I've been talking about on the implementation of UN guiding principles. As I said, not because of there's a human rights, business and human rights national action plan, it's going to mean that things are solved or that it's going to be something mandatory or it's going to be magic solution for all the problems that are related to the human rights violations committed by these enterprises. But it's quite an advance, at least to make the guiding principles as real as possible. But there's another initiative led by Ecuador in the United Nations. On 2013, there started this process on the United Nations, and there was a joint statement on the 24th session of the Human Rights Council. And this joint statement was signed by 85 countries of all the world. We can see the Arab countries and the African countries, and also Venezuela, Cuba, Ecuador, etc. And this joint statement just outlined the need to have a legally binding mechanism to address the human rights violations committed by enterprises. And it was taken into account, and there was made a very big process of advocacy in and out the United Nations just to carry out this initiative further, because it's much more obvious now that the multi-stakeholder and voluntary initiatives are not working. As we can see, the implementation of the guiding principles as being a voluntary initiative, it's not working. It's not a high percentage of countries just running to make a national action plan. So that is the complaint, the main complaint of these countries, which are experiencing many abuses from transnational corporations. So it was made this joint statement in 2013, and in early 2014, a group of organizations and movements and networks of human rights organizations established the Treaty Alliance. So they are now advocating for a binding treaty on business and human rights. They had a big work of advocacy, as I said, in and out the United Nations regarding this issue, and they made lots of observations and also critiques to the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles and how it should be evolved on a legally binding initiative. So in the 26th of June in 2014, the Human Rights Council adopted the resolution 26.9 led by Ecuador and South Africa. They put this into voting on the Human Rights Council. And it was established an intergovernmental working group that is going to work towards a legally binding instrument on business and human rights. So it means that it's established now a working group, intergovernmental working group, which is already talking about and discussing about the possibilities of a binding treaty on business and human rights. It's a hope for many organizations, because they see the binding treaty is going to be a very big step forward on this issue. But as we see it, it's a very long process. A process towards binding treaty is going to take at least 10 years to have a draft of a binding treaty on business and human rights. So we're not like we're not having doubts about the process, but we're realistic about the possibilities of having something very fast. And the first session of the Intergovernmental Working Group was set on July 2015, from July 6th to July 10th. And the main the first two sessions of this group are going to be based on the discussion and the debate of the content and coverage of the treaty, which already caused some debates on the working group. There's a very big opposition of US, the United States, Canada, and the European Union to the discussion of this treaty. So in the first session, which was on July 2015, as I said, the representatives of United States, Canada, and many countries of the European Union just abandoned the room because they didn't want to talk about the binding treaty, and they wanted to boycott the discussion. The main thing that was discussed was what was going to be the outreach of the treaty. I mean, it's going to be only for multinational corporations, like the big corporations like Shell, Chevron, BP, or I don't know, these big companies which are developing big projects in other countries, or it could be applied to any company in any part of the world. I mean, small company or the transnational company. That was the discussion, and some groups said, especially the group led by Ecuador, said that it should be applied to all the enterprises, and the European Union said that it should be applied to, I mean, it was the opposite way. The group said by Ecuador and these other countries, Venezuela and Cuba and everything, they said it should be focused on multinational enterprises, and the European Union and the United States and Canada said that it's not that fair to make that, but it's only to fit the debate and to make the conversation not to move forward. So it's a very, very complicated process. The next session of this Binding Treaty Intergovernmental Working Group is going to be on October of this year. So we are expecting to see what is going to happen. In the meantime, since the Human Rights Council adopted the resolution of creating this group of the Binding Treaty, many countries have started, especially the developed countries, started to announce the implementation of national action plans on their countries. So the trend now is to set a bet on the UN guiding principles and how the voluntary principles can be applied, and they can be respected by all the stakeholders that are part of the business and human rights agenda. And that is the discussion that far, and I'm very happy to hear and read your comments and your questions and everything you have to say. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Elena, for that very enlightening presentation. I think that gives us a lot of knowledge of where the state of business and human rights is, and also I read so that you can we can both fit, and where we're going as well, right? So we would like also to know who is on the other side of the screen. So if you could share your organization and name in the chat, that would be awesome. And please, if you have any questions or comments, please you can put it on the chat. And we have 20 minutes for this, so please ask and comment. So maybe while we wait for your comments and questions, what do you think are the next steps for the focal group here in Mexico? Yeah.
Well, the next step. Hi, Omar. Hi. I know Omar. Hola. Mucho gusto. The next step for the focal group on business and human rights now is to keep the conversation with the Ministry of Internal Affairs, but also to keep the process of the national baseline assessment. We are working very hard to have the draft or the final version for July or August of this year, so that we can go with the process of the government and for us it's very important to have the opinion of the communities and the groups which are mainly affected by the actions of enterprises, and that is vital in both processes: the national action plan, but also the national baseline assessment, which are the main focus of our work right now.
Oh, perfect. And I would like to know, how have you have links with other processes, such as the one that in Mexico is having with other countries?
Well, as a focal group, we have this alliance with the International Corporate Accountability Roundtable, which is giving us an escort process of how to develop the methodology of the national baseline assessment with their toolkit, and also how to take the consultations with the population. We have done 3 workshops, or 2 workshops, no, 3, with different populations and in different regions of Mexico, just to have their input on how the process should be done. And we are binding through ICAR with other countries such as Chile, such as Colombia, and we also have looked for the vision not only from the civil society, but also from the embassies, for example, which have information about the process of the national action plan from their country. So we are all the time just looking. For example, the National Action Plan in South Africa, we are very much looking forward to the publication. Also, the National Baseline Assessment was published like 4 months ago in Germany, and the process in Germany is led by the Human Rights Institute also.
Okay, so we have a question from Fabricio. He's saying, thanks, Elena. I'm Director of Responsible Investment at SUMA, an energy company in Mexico. My question is, besides the history, what can be applied now? It seems that it will take years to have a national action plan.
Well, it's not going to take years. For example, in Mexico, I mean, we're going to have a national action plan very soon. The plan of the government is to have it as soon as possible. So we're going to have a national action plan very soon. What it's going to take a lot of time is to have a binding treaty on business and human rights, because the discussions on the Human Rights Council and the Intergovernmental Working Group are going to be very, very long. And there's also the treaty initiative, which is working right now mainly on draft an example of a binding treaty led by civil society and communities affected by the corporations. So that is the process, but it's going to be really long, of the binding treaty. National action plan is not that long.
So, what tips, thinking about the private sector, what tips could you give to a company regarding the implementation?
Well, regarding the implementation, and also a very good tip that I think that is very useful for the enterprises is just to apply the due diligence. I mean, it's not that difficult to have this dialogue if you can and you have the willing to approach to the communities and to discuss with them what they want, if they want the project, because it's going to avoid many future problems, right? So I think the main thing for the enterprises, or the main tip I could give is that just follow the due diligence, and it's going to be a very, very good step forward.
Perfect. Any more questions or comments from the other side? Oh.
Yes, there are guides for due diligence, especially the UN guided principles have some parts of comments. As I said, the 31 principles could be filled in 2 or 3 pages, but they have a lot of comments. And on the comments, we can see a little bit on how to make due diligence processes, but also, for example, the Danish Institute of Human Rights also has a lot of publications about how to do a process of due diligence and human rights impact assessments with communities on the context of the activity of corporations. So yes, there is lots of, mainly on the guiding principles, but there are other initiatives.
We can also maybe share
sure.
after this some materials including this overview, and then we have the toolkit and other documents that we can share. Any more comments? I'm sharing. Sorry if I'm spamming you a little bit here, but but I'm sharing the website from all the actors involved to make this happen. So, but we still have 10 more minutes in case you have more comments or questions. So I don't know, Elena, if you want to add something while there.
Yeah, but just saying that our vision, as at least as focal group of business and human rights, but also the vision of PRODESC, is to give a chance to the guiding principles to be implemented. We know that it's not the best initiative, and we also look forward for a binding treaty, but the thing we have and that we can apply now is the guiding principles through a national action plan, and it is very important to have the feedback and the participation of most of civil society and communities, because it's going to make it a bigger and richer process. Yes, that's the main. I think it's the main message. I mean, the guiding principles have lots of gaps, and also things about the extraterritorial obligations, for example, that are not quite developed or something. And some people say that they are much in compliance with the corporations, and they're not taking into account the vision of the communities or the civil society. But I think that we should give them a chance, and we can make the process much more richer until we have something much more solid on the business and human rights agenda regarding the binding treaty.
Good. So I don't see any more questions or comments, so maybe we can wrap up now so that we can continue with this amazing day that we started sharing so much. So thanks, Elena, so much for accompanying us and giving us this presentation. I think it gives us a lot to think about and to take action to. And so just a few announcements. We are going to share all the documents that we were talking about.
Yes.
And we are going to also have this webinar translated into Spanish, so that, and we're going to share it with all of you in case you want to share as well with other organizations and people. And we are also having another set of webinars in the near future, May. We are going to have another perspective from the information that we saw today. In this case, it's going to be from the academic side, from Umberto Cantu. He's from a university in France. He's also an expert on the topic, so we are also having that webinar on May 4th. but we are also having like, how can you say, like the second step after this, which is going to be more in-depth information about special cases that organizations in Mexico have dealt with, and more about the binding treaty process. So please keep in touch, and we will be sending this information. So if there's nothing more from your side, we would just want to thank you for taking the time and for your participation in this early moment. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.